of Celia Bertoia, and today I'm going to talk to you about my relationship with my father. And I'm really a little bit more nervous than usual because this is an intimate sharing. We're not going to see a lot of sculptures today. I'm just going to talk about Harry and my relationship with him. I want to impart to you what an amazing person he was. He was very strong, not only physically, but emotionally, and with his focus, incredibly driven and focused. I learned from watching him. He did tell us teaching stories sometimes, but mostly I learned by example. And I will say that right from the get-go, now I don't remember the early years, but my mother used to tell me and my siblings would tell me that Harry just loved me. Of course, he loves other children too, but apparently I was the favorite. I don't know. But you can see right from the start, there was a love and a bond between young Harry and his little child, Celia. And I guess the story is when Harry would come home from work about 5 o'clock every day, he would, I'd hear the car come in the driveway, and as a toddler, I'd go running out to greet him and give him big hugs. And that's not unusual for any child to do that with their father, but my brother and sister had different relationships with him, as is true in any family. Each child has a totally different concept of their parents, even though they're the same people. They might be in the same house, eating the same meals, but it's different. And for whatever reason, we had a good bond. And I was the only child who had blue eyes like he did. Maybe I was a little more Italian. I don't know what it was. But keep in mind that we lived in a beautiful countryside estate with a pond and just a gorgeous place. And oftentimes our family activities were just going for a walk or wandering around the estate or the roads in the neighborhood. And Harry as a father, and again, this is probably no different from most situations, but as a young father, when Brigida and Harry married in Detroit, in the Detroit area at Cranbrook, and in the 40s, and then they moved to California. And in California, for a few years, Harry was with the Charles Eames team, and he had a regular salary. But they had a bit of a falling out, and Harry left and really had no steady income. He was getting a small stipend from the Nierendorf Gallery in New York, but that ended when Nierendorf died. And he would sell his jewelry and monotypes here and there. But they were struggling. And you can imagine, here, my sister was born there in California, and then Val, my brother, was born. So here's this young, struggling artist, 2 children and a wife to support, And he was probably kind of uptight about it all, stressed. And my siblings tell me he was pretty strict, and they were sort of afraid of him. And even Brigitta, I think, was a bit afraid of him. He had quite a temper. But when the family moved to Pennsylvania, and I was born there in Pennsylvania, and it wasn't too long, just a year or two before we found this beautiful place. And he was working for Knoll a couple of years, had a good salary. Things were easing up. He was making some money, and then he got into all the commercial commissions, the public commissions. So he could relax a little bit. And I was born at that time. He was already starting the commissions, getting these large chunks of money, and so he was probably just not so stressed out. And although I respected him, and there were moments of fear when he was angry, and he had quite a temper at times, my relationship was easier and more playful, really. And you have to keep in mind, too, that my sister Lesta is 10 years older than me, and my brother Val is 5 years older than me. So I had a nice chunk of time when I was in the house alone with my parents. So I really got to know them both in a different way. I'll tell you one family story that exemplifies a few of Carrie's characteristics. And that was the TV story. I was probably 5 or, let's say 5 years old, somewhere in there. And we had recently gotten the TV, which was a big deal. So it's around 1960. We lived in the house that we lived in, this old stone house, had those kind of radiators, big metal contraptions that hot water would run through, and that's how we heated the house. And those radiators were absolutely wonderful for throwing your winter coat on top of them so they'd get all warm and toasty for when you went out again. Now, we weren't supposed to do that. We children were not supposed to put our coats on the radiator because it prevented the radiator from doing its job and heating the house. And Harry had told us repeatedly, don't do that. But it was just so enticingly inviting to put your coat on the radiator. So one day, Harry came home from work, and each family member has a slightly different memory of this incident. But as I remember it, Harry came home from work. He saw those darn coats on the radiator. And perhaps he had a bad day at work, I don't know. But he was mad. He threw them off the radiator, says to Brigitte, where are the children? And we, unfortunately, were all upstairs in the den watching TV. Now, this, of course, addresses another characteristic of Harry. He was such a workaholic. He worked a lot. He worked hard. And he couldn't understand this whole attraction of TV. And why were we children watching TV when we should have been doing homework or running around outside or whatever? So he comes stomping up the stairs and enters the room. And immediately we saw, uh-oh, this is trouble. And without a word, he goes over to the TV. And now remember, he's a very strong, powerful bulldog of a man. Without bothering to unplug the TV and there's a big contraption, He just grabs it, and I'll have to, okay. So you see this house, and up here was the balcony. It was a second level porch, if you will. And we were watching TV right inside there. So he grabs the TV, manages to hold it with one arm while he's opening the door with the other. And he goes out on the balcony and he just tosses that TV out into the lawn. And we were all sort of stunned and terrified. The TV has wires flying out of it and it's all broken up. No one touched that TV for, it had to be a week or two. We were all just really kind of stunned by the whole thing. And Val, of course, did go, and he was the engineer of the family. He really wanted to figure out how the thing worked. But it got the message across. And I don't think we put our coats on the radiator after that. So just a sampling of my father. And it was mostly up to my mom, to Brigitte, to do the daily routines and the discipline and getting us ready for events and whatnot. But Harry was always present, and he was very stable, very solid. We used to go to the New Jersey shore once or twice a year. From our home in Pennsylvania, it was something like a 2 or 3 hour drive. I can remember my mom would be going through New Jersey through the industrial section. She'd have a handkerchief with perfume on it and would cover her nose because that area was stinky. And these things that stick in your head. Anyway, we'd get to the beach, and Harry's poor bald head would always get burned. But we kids loved it. But I do remember this incident where, and again, I was probably just, 5 or 7 years old. And I went running into the ocean, not realizing there was quite an undertow. And somehow I got swept up in the waves. And you probably all had that experience. You're getting tossed and turned, and you're panicking and not even sure which way is up. And I'm a little kid and I'm freaking out. And then at some point I feel these strong hands grab me and save me. Of course, it was my father. And that's really emblematic of who he was. He protected his people. He was looking out for his children. And although I honestly don't remember him ever saying the words, "I love you," I felt that. I know I felt that. I felt totally loved and taken care of by my dad. And because of their European background, both my mother and father, we called them Mummy and Daddy. So I never use those terms because they're kind of odd. Making sure I'm telling you all the stories I wanted to tell you. Yeah. I will show you a little demonstration, and I've written about this in one of my blogs, but this too says a lot about Harry. You see this glass of water here. All right. So Harry had been raised Catholic, but really was not a religious man at all. He was a spiritual man, and I'm not sure where he got his beliefs and his philosophy, but they were very Eastern. George Nakashima and Celia Bertoia had a simpatico because they both had sort of an Eastern philosophy. And then later Thomas Dunn, the architect, who is pushing 90 now, but I'm thinking alive. They too shared that Eastern philosophy. But Harry believed and explained to us children, this was one of his teaching stories, that when a human being dies, their soul, their little spark of life, goes back to the great oneness, as he called it, or the divine universe. And it may retain its individuality for a time, but eventually it merges with the universe. And the way he demonstrated that was, now he did this with one of those pens where you can drop a drop of ink, but I have to do it with a watercolor here. But that, okay, so you've got that little soul, and it goes back into the universe, and you see the blue for a while, and you see that individual color. I don't know if you can actually see it very well, but the blue, at a certain point, it just dissolves back into the oneness. And the impact is not quite as impactful as it was with the ink pen, but that story stuck with me, and I was quite young. Lester was still around, so I had to be maybe 5 or 6 years old. But Harry would tell these stories once in a while, and it was wonderful. And sitting around the dinner table was never boring at our family. We would talk about philosophy and life on other planets, or where were you before you were born? All these really big life questions. Okay, so moving on to when my sister was off living her life. My brother at 18 went off to college. So I was about 13. I was going to school, and I became sort of like an only child. And I have to say I enjoyed that, just hanging out with my parents. And I think my father and I really became closer then. One of my duties was I was his hairdresser. And Harry, he was bald on the top, but he did have hair. It was quite straight, and he wouldn't really pay much attention to his hair. So I would cut it, and then he would just let it grow long. So if I didn't come home, once I'd left for college, if I didn't come home for 6 months, his hair would have grown for 6 months. He kind of looked like an old hippie. But here's a picture of Celia and Harry out on the lawn, and we'd have these half-hour stints of just talking, and he'd ask me about school, or if I had a boyfriend, or whatever. And probably not too long after that, in fact, when I was about 17, I had my first serious boyfriend. And I was a bit of a wild child. So before too long, we were getting intimate. And by this time, the Sanambian barn Harry had put a loft in there, and that's where he used to do his monotypes. And he actually had a mattress up there. I think he used to take naps once in a while. Well, my guy and I discovered this mattress and put it to good use. And I was kind of a stupid young teenager. Well, Harry discovered the evidence. The whole thing was uh, just one of those teenage things. But Harry pulled me aside, and it was a very uncomfortable situation for him because he really wanted to convey his message to me that actions have consequences, and you're when you're becoming an adult, you have to start taking responsibility for what you do. So he's starting to talk to me, and honestly, I didn't even know what the heck he was talking about because he could never bring himself to use the word sex or physical relationship. He's just talking about responsibility and consequences. And finally, I figured out what he meant, and it all dawned on me that he was talking about, oh, okay, we were messing around up there, and he wants me to be careful. And I felt compassion for my father. I think that might have been the first time I really felt that because he was so uncomfortable, but he felt it was his duty to protect his daughter. And he didn't say don't do it. He said be smart about it. So actually, at that point, I went to our family doctor who had given me my polio shots when I was a kid and got the pill, Dr. Kistler. So Harry took care of me once again. Uh, this is one of my favorite pictures of Harry and I. And I was probably uh, 17 or so at that point. And that's just Harry and I walking on one of the roads around our house. Brigitte took the picture. So it was the threesome of us, Brigitte and Harry and I, for quite a while. And it was kind of nice. My mom and I would go out shopping or to a local botanical garden. We had a good time. There were tough times too, believe me. But then, let's see here. Yeah, and there was another household hobby that we partook in, and that was chess, playing chess. And especially in the winter, after dinner, my parents would play games of chess. And they would bet $1 each on the games. They were both very good players. But because my mother was so quick and could see things sort of 5 steps ahead, she usually won. But they basically were fairly evenly matched, but she usually did win. But I would sit and watch them play chess. And ironically, my husband, Kyle, he won't play chess with me anymore because I always beat him. But yeah, again, most of what I learned from my father was just by example. He was very methodical and moved with just the steadiness, like an elephant almost. And he had the wisdom of an elephant too. So finally, the time came in 1977. Harry only lived to 1978. Harry was diagnosed with lung cancer and given a short sentence of life. And I don't think I fully realized how serious it was. I was off in college. I was doing my own thing by that time. I was in my early 20s. And that last year, 1978, you wouldn't believe what Harry accomplished in that year. He had several exhibitions. He traveled to Norway, had a major exhibition over there. And he started compiling all his papers, and he wanted to get out his Somnambient albums before he passed. He wanted to get out this monotype book. before he passed. He knew his time was limited, so he was working just like the devil. And in June of that year, he had a show lined up at a gallery in Aspen, the Patricia Moore Gallery. And I was living in Colorado by that time. So he came to visit me, and I was very honored that he came to visit me. He probably thought he might not see me again. And I had purchased my first house. I was in real estate, so I managed to find a good deal on this old, dilapidated country farmhouse. And it was falling apart, and we had taken the chicken coop and revamped it and made it into a guest house, and that's where my parents stayed. It had a sloping shed roof, so my mom got up and bumped her head, and she was complaining, Celia, can't you give us a more decent place to stay? But my father, I think he understood, and when you're getting closer to your own mortality, you become more passionate. And he said something like, he looked at me and smiled, and he said, I think Celia has done very well. She has her first house, and it's just lovely. I don't even know what the words were, but he said something to make me feel good about myself. He didn't hand out compliments easily, but when he did, we knew it was for real. Well, so then come about Halloween time, end of October, everyone knew his time was close. And Brigitte called all of his children home. We were in various parts of the country. Everyone came home. And I remember so clearly, Harry called us into his room. He was bedridden by that point, but he sat up in bed. And his room was very sparse, almost stark, like a monk's room, if you will. But at that point, he had lots of books and papers lined up next to his bed. He was trying to finish everything. But he called us there because he wanted to prepare us for his death. Now, most people would be fearful for their own death and what was coming. But Harry had this amazing calm, and he wanted to take care of his children one more time. And he explained that he really had accomplished quite a bit and felt that he had left his mark on the world. He had an impact on humanity, which obviously he really did. And then now it was up to us children to carry on. And he was very proud of us, and something he rarely said. And that he had already been seeing the other side. He had been seeing past relatives and his parents. And so he knew they were waiting for him, and he was ready. And he did not want us to grieve and mourn over his death, because death is just a transition, just a passing into another state. Your soul goes back to that other place. And he wanted to spare us of the crying and the mourning and all that sadness that usually accompanies death. And we were probably in there for 45 minutes or an hour, and we didn't ask questions, really. We just listened. And it was very powerful. It was very powerful, and it was a huge gift. If I can be as graceful and gracious in my passing, I would be very grateful for that, because it allowed me, when he did pass, the next week, it was just a week later on November 6th, I didn't even cry. I didn't cry. I remembered all the great things about him and what he had accomplished in my relationship with him. And yeah, I was sad. I mean, I get close to tears now more even than I did then. But he had prepared the way and made it much easier for me, anyway, to accept his passing. So that happened, and I went on and lived my life and had several different careers and was a bit of a crazy young adult for a while. But we'll skip to when I finally came back to this work. I've only been associated with the Bertoia legacy for about just about not even 10 years. So it was in, let's see, okay, somewhere around 2008, I think it was. My husband Kyle and I had a race timing business in Montana, and we were doing all the registration and timing for 5Ks and marathons and whatnot. And our business had become so successful that we really hardly even had time to run ourselves. We got into it because we were runners. But we were really busy, and I started to think, gosh, I think we need to sell this business and move on to something else. And what would be my next step? I was in my 50s, and you start thinking about what's important for me to do in this life. Well, I started to think about my father, and that no one was really carrying the torch for Harry Bertoia, and maybe that was my job. Which, when he first passed, I would have been the least likely person. I was just all over the country and running around. And my sister had been the valedictorian and so responsible and had children. And my brother had worked with Harry in the shop, so they were more likely, logically, to do it. But for whatever reason, I became the one. Now, my brother does still work in the shop, but he kind of more does his own thing. He's a sculptor also. So I started thinking about this. So I put it out to the universe. I would like to further the legacy of my father, Harry Bertoia. Well, you make a statement like that to the universe, and the way I was raised, with Harry and Brigitta as my teachers, the universe listens. And I got, so we call it a message, back from the universe maybe a month or two later after I had made that decision. I got a call from a woman who had seen my name in the local paper. Bozeman's a small place. I was probably in the paper for some races or something. And I kept my maiden name even when I married Kyle, because I liked the name. So she called, and I hear this elderly woman on the phone. Are you related to Harry Bertoia? And in those days, I really didn't talk about my father very much, so I knew something was up. And I said, yeah, he's my father. What can I help you with? Well, it turns out that Jane Van Alsten, who lived in Bozeman, which is amazing in itself, had gone to Cranbrook and taken a jewelry class from Harry Bertoia in the 1940s. So here we're talking 2008, so it's almost 70 years later. And she had become a successful designer for General Motors and helped with the Corvette. And she was successful in her own right. And she had become a professor at Montana State University. She was retired at this point in her 80s. And she said, look, in class one day, Harry made a sample ring the lost wax process, and it happened to be my size, and he gave me the ring. And now my hands are all swollen and arthritic, and I want to give the ring back to the family. So I met with her and heard about her memories, and she gave me the ring, and I put it on. It fit perfectly, and I've never taken it off. So I've got Kyle on one hand and Harry on the other hand, my two main men. Oh, here, I'm going to drink from the universe. So that was sort of my first indication that I was on the right path, and I've had many of those moments. I almost can't even tell you. Yeah, there were numerous of them. I see I'm going longer than usual, so I'll finish up here. In 2009, I had the chance to go to Italy and visit Harry's hometown. And this was a wonderful moment. Lesta and I are visiting the chapel that Harry had heard the bell ringing. And it was a moving moment for me because that bell was their Twitter. It would ring for a wedding, it would ring for a funeral or for a birth. And there I was. And they didn't use that chapel anymore, but some of the young men went up into the bell tower, and they rang the bell for us. And I really felt connected to my dad at that point. And it's such a beautiful place over there in Italy. I'm so sad they're having a hard time now. And bizarrely, one of the wonderful things that happened to me in Italy, in America, there aren't many Bertoias. In fact, I'm probably related to any Bertoia I meet. But I went to the local cemetery in San Lorenzo, north of Venice there, where Harry grew up. And on the headstones, there were Bertoias everywhere. And I finally felt like it was the ugly duckling who found her fellow swans. This, by the way, is one of our Bertoia monotype stars. Okay, I will. In 2013, we finally got approval for the Harry Bertoia Foundation. It's been a steep learning curve for me, but I love every minute of what I'm doing. And I will let you know about one more wonderful incident. In 2018, in December, it's not too long ago, or 2019, I should say. So just, 4 months ago, Sotheby's, we coordinated a Sonambian concert, and I was playing the instruments, which I hadn't seen out of their crates for numerous years. And I was so happy to be with the Sonambian sculptures. I was playing a concert, and I really was thinking about my dad. I thought, I just want to channel Harry here. And at one point, I was standing still and letting the sounds fill the room, and I felt a touch on my shoulder. It felt like someone's hand brushed my shoulder. It was so marked that I looked around and there was no one there. But I know who was there. Harry was with me. He was often with me. So now you understand a little bit more of how the Harry Bertoia Foundation came about and why I'm so passionate about what I do. I loved my father. He loved me. And I will As we're closing, I'll play a few of the sounding sculptures. Thank you.